That is the only shootout in the entire West in which 4 lawmen were killed. I have done programs in wind before, and occasionally a couple of pages will fly off. That would shorten the talk, wouldn't it? I'm very grateful to Chuck Parsons and to Jeff Jackson for inviting me to participate in this fallen officer event at the cemetery where my grandparents and other relatives are interred. They're over in that direction. John Albertus Sweet, he was born in New York State in 1843. His father, Ennis Sweet, had 2 sons and several daughters when he lost his wife. The widower moved his clan to Illinois. Then, after a time, Ennis and Albertus joined the American migration to Texas, and brother, it was a migration. We became a state, you know, in 1846, so our first census was in 1850, and we had at that time 212,000 some odd people. And 10 years later, as the 1850s passed, in 1860 we had 600 and some odd thousand. Our population tripled. During the 1850s, we were the fastest growing state in the Union. And it doesn't take but a minute and gunplay exploded. All 4 of the law officers were gunned down. 3 of them died right there on the floor. And the other one, the 4th one, died of his wound later on. That is the only shootout in the entire West in which 4 lawmen were killed. By this time, Albertus was 23. He was 5'6", 135 to 40 pounds. It was said of him by a couple of people that he had a quote, quote, fine physique. He had blue eyes and a gap between his front teeth. He wore a sweeping black mustache and completed the facial hair with an imperial right there. He was quick to anger, they said, and he was indeed fearless. When he visited an eastern state, a newspaper reporter wrote that he was a quote, quote, he was a typical Texan with his full equipment of small arms. Now, he was an officer of the law in Texas, and so when he went east, he went healed, you know, with his full equipment of small arms. During the Civil War, Albertus enlisted in a Confederate unit based in Austin. It was the 17th Texas Infantry. Now, Texans flocked to the colors. In that census of 1860 that I mentioned, there were 92,000 some odd Texas men between the ages of 17 and 45, military age, and over 70,000 of them donned uniforms during the Civil War, including, of course, Albertus. 70,000 out of 92,000. So he followed the Texas colors in that way. In '62, right in the middle of war, he married Lavinia Ann Stockman. She was young, but Albertus and Lavinia had 6 children, including my contact, Lena Rivers Sweet, born on February 9, 1868. Now, Albertus and Lavinia made their home in Lampasas County, and by 1873, he was a deputy sheriff. Now, he was drawn to law enforcement, as many men are. Good lawmen certainly were needed. During that era, Lampasas, Texas was the gunfighter capital of the West. And boy, I can prove that with statistics. There were a lot more gunfighters in Texas than anywhere else. There were twice as many gunfights, shootouts in Texas as anywhere else. Many gunfighters were killed in Texas, more of them anyway. And there was, my goodness, there were more blood feuds in Texas than anywhere else. Including one right here. Now, Tascosa was the gunfighter capital of Texas during the 1880s, but some of you may remember a program I did here a couple of years ago trying to prove that Lampasas was the gunfighter capital of Texas during the 70s. And so, in December of '73, Deputy Sheriff Sweet got himself elected Lampasas County Sheriff. Sheriff Sweet promptly organized a posse to go after the notorious Horrell brothers. 2 or 3 of them are buried near here. If you want to, I know Jeff would be glad to show you the grave, and it's undetermined whether there's 2 there or 3 or whatever. Not all 7 of them. A couple of them were killed elsewhere. They were notorious as cattle thieves and gunmen. Now, on that subject, they were in the center of a unique Western gunfight. It was a saloon fight that occurred on March 14th, 1873 at just off the northwest corner of the square. There was a Texas State Police detachment that was sent down from Austin under a Captain Williams, and their assignment was to haul in the Horrell brothers and their brothers-in-law and everybody else that rode with them. So they got here on the square, and Captain Williams was tipped off that there was a whole nest of them over in this saloon. So he detailed some of the other guys to go looking around, and he took 3 of his men, that meant 4 officers, entered that saloon. Sure enough, there were the Horrell boys. There were all kinds of brothers-in-law and other people. That was a very close clan. There have been other shootouts in which there were 3 lawmen killed. That's the only one right here in Lampasas where 3 were killed. One of the Horrell brothers was badly wounded. He was jailed over in Georgetown, and he was nursed by his wife, and when he got back to some kind of decent health, she tipped off the other brothers. They came roaring in there with the brothers-in-law and so forth, and they had a shootout with the citizens. It was after dark, and they ran. One of the brothers-in-law banged on the Georgetown cell door with a sledgehammer, knocked it loose, and then they came out of there with this guy. They headed for New Mexico. When they got to New Mexico, before long and predictably, there was the Horrell War. That's what it's called out there. It was out in Lincoln County, which is the largest county in the United States at that time. And there were some Horrell casualties, but there were an awful lot of casualties on the other side. And they came on back to Texas. They got back and found out that Sheriff Sweet had been reelected at this point. And by the way, out in Lincoln County, they settled that thing down, but in no time, another war broke out, a much more famous one, the Lincoln County War, starring Billy the Kid, of course. The Horrells back in Lampasas County pretty soon got in some trouble again, and in 1877, the Horrell-Higgins Feud broke out, and it was pretty much a 6-month affair. And the biggest event of that was on June 7th, 77. It's called the Battle on the Square, and it lasted for a couple of hours. Sheriff Sweet wrote to Major Jones, Major John B. Jones. He was commander of the Frontier Battalion of Texas Rangers, and he said, look, we gotta have some kind of help. Major Jones brought 15 Texas Rangers down. They camped at Hannah Springs, and he went to work and arranged a truce. 1878, Major Sheriff Sweet and a deputy arrested William Seymour Justice. He was a Horrell brother-in-law. He was a former editor of the Lampasas Dispatch, and he was a former deputy sheriff of all things. But it turned out he was also wanted back in his home state of West Virginia. So Sheriff Sweet, he and the deputy arrested him. Sheriff Sweet shackled himself to him, and he took him to West Virginia. And while he was back east, he visited his brothers and sisters, and it's a good thing, because, well, we'll see what happened to him. Anyway, on December 15th, 1878, another interesting thing happened to the Horrell boys, and all of this is stirring up a lot of trouble for our sheriff. The Horrell boys, late in 1878, were 2 of them, Martin and Tom, were accused of, suspected of killing a storekeeper outside of Meridian and robbing him blind. And so they got him in jail, and nobody ever been able to do anything much with these Horrell boys, and thus About 100 of the townspeople moved in on that jail. It was just a small jail off the square, and about 50 of them got inside and they stuck their guns through the bars, not going to waste any rope on those guys, and they started shooting. And they killed both of them. One of them had 9 bullets in him, and another one had 22. Sounds a little like that Ben Thompson thing. Anyway, in all of this turbulence, this and more, Sheriff Sweet was a target of criticism, at least by one faction, and so he was defeated the 3rd time he ran for sheriff. He's been elected twice, but he got defeated. Now, maybe he was relieved not to be the center of controversy anymore, so he just stayed in Lampasas with his wife and family. He built a saloon called The Favorite, but he wasn't cut out for saloon work, and he sold it in 1880. He farmed a little. Well, he just quickly decided he wasn't cut out for that either, and then opportunity knocked. He had the chance to return to law enforcement, and so he pinned on a badge as Deputy City Marshal at Belton. He left his family in Lampasas County. The way law enforcement was set up at that time, the city marshal was chief of police. And don't think about Gunsmoke, because they've got a federal marshal acting as the city marshal and everything else. And the city marshal was the chief of police. If he had a deputy or 2 or 3, they were the cops. They were the members of the police force. And so he's putting on a badge as a deputy city marshal. Now, Belton and Bell County were rough. The Balcones Escarpment, which is a topographical feature that runs right up through the middle of Bell County, going east to west. The Balcones Escarpment on the east side, Bell County was fine, lots of farming and stock raising and towns. And then where that Balcones Escarpment is, it was very rugged country, ravines, all kinds of caves, natural hideouts, it turned out, for rustlers. They're stolen stock, and it's just a good place to hide out. As one guy found out who axe murdered his wife. A guy did that, and he headed for that country. Well, that was, by gosh, that was enough. And therefore, about 200 men got together, not all from Bell County. That was just a hideout, so men from other counties got in on this thing too, because they were having trouble, and they made a sweep of that broken area in there. And they came up with 10 guys, 10 bad guys. They threw them in jail in Belton. Belton's jail was a 2-story, brand new, almost brand new. It was 2 years old. It was a red brick building, and it had a holding cell, a large cell in the bottom floor. Well, the bunch of guys, most of them came back at night. They broke into the jail. There wasn't any problem with that. No jailer is going to fight to the death to defend rustlers and an axe murderer. They just let them in. Because they're fighting their neighbors and so forth. Well, they didn't fight them. They let them in. And these guys crowded around that cell. Now, this happened in 1874, 4 years before the same type of thing happened on a smaller scale in Meridian. And these guys stuck their guns through the bars and opened up and killed all 9 of these guys. And that was one of the most eye-opening lynching incidents in the West. In Belton, not long before Sweet signed on, an officer from the deputies, a deputy sheriff, had been killed. Another officer was killed not too long after Deputy Sweet fell in the line of duty. The city marshal at that time was James T. Holbert. He was about the same age. I think he was about 1 year older than Sweet. In 1879, Holbert fired 3 shots at a fleeing horse thief and knocked him off his horse with a lasso. They paced it off at 180 yards. Quite a shot with open sights in those days. There was another exchange of shots with a bad guy who hit the marshal in the shoulder and soon was sent to the penitentiary. There were other violent incidents. This was the town where Deputy Sweet decided to resume his law enforcement career. This was where he was charged with keeping the law. In December '81, a couple of troublemakers named Ellis Chalk and Eugene Methvin. Methvin had been fired a couple of years earlier by Major Jones. He was a Texas Ranger, and let me quote, he was fired, quote, for drunkenness and riotous misbehavior while a ranger. So he was not a model ranger. And now he and Chalk, both of them pretty young guys, and they were volatile, and they had put the word out that they were going to get this Marshall Hobart. On Thursday night, December 8, 1881 now, Deputy Sweet learned that Chalk and Methvin were lying in wait for Marshall Hobart near the courthouse square. Around midnight, Marshall Hobart, Deputy Sweet, and a guy they had just deputized named Wiseman, they went looking for Chalk and Methvin around the square. Spotting the two hard cases lurking near a store, Deputy Wiseman advanced. Chalk and Methvin began shouting at Wiseman, so Marshal Hobart and Deputy Sweet came running up to back up their fellow officer. Marshal Hobart announced his intention to arrest the two of them. At that point, gunfire broke out. Chalk swung up a double-barrel shotgun and loosed a blast that hit Sweet in the left arm. I guess he was raising it a little bit because 3 of the buckshot penetrated his torso beneath his arm, and he dropped dead, just like that. 3 of the buckshot, Marshal Hobart also was hit in the left arm himself. He fired 2 pistol shots before he went down, but Chalk and Methvin by this time had disappeared into the darkness. A coroner's jury soon was assembled. They just gathered around the deceased. They ruled that Deputy Sweet was killed between midnight and 1 by Ellis Chalk. Albertus Sweet was returned to his family here in Lampasas and buried. He was 38 years of age. His widow and daughter stayed in Lampasas, and in 1883, 15-year-old Lena married Pink Higgins. Meanwhile, both Methvin in 1882 and Chalk 2 years later, they were tried and acquitted. It took a while to apprehend them, but when they were tried, each jury stayed out no more than an hour. The grounds of acquittal were largely that the lawmen, this sounds kind of woke to us today, the lawmen had advanced in overly menacing fashion, thus triggering gunfire from the poor little innocent Methvin and Chalk. Let me close with this. Frontier lawman Albertus Sweet was shot to death in 1881. That's just over 140 years ago. Today we try to provide full honors to the fallen lawman who protected our, well, throughout our society, our troubled society. You know, we have parades and so forth, but our society was troubled and dangerous 140 years ago too. Yet Albertus Sweet and men like him fearlessly laid their lives on the line in the cause of law and order. I expect that whatever we've done to honor him is long overdue, and I commend Chuck and Jeff and the others who have helped organize and publicize. We've had remarkable publicity for this, and I commend them for doing their part to honor that fallen lawman.